When we talk about English literature, we always associate the history of English literature with Britain because Britain is the place from where the language English originated. Thus, knowing the history of Britain is very important for a student of English literature. So, in all the topics that we are going to cover, I'll make sure that I could provide a good account of the history of the time before moving into the literature of the times. So, in this video, we are going to talk about the Anglo Saxon period and also the literature of the time, the Anglo Saxon literature or the Old English literature. Let's begin from the earliest or the original inhabitants of Britain. Now, Britain is a country which was continuously invaded by other tribes and other countries. We will see an effect of all these invasions in the history of their literature too. But anyway, the people who actually inhabited Britain, the original inhabitants of Britain, were Celts and the Gaels. The first major invasion that was faced by the Celts and the Gaels was the Roman invasion. Now, during those times, the Romans were thought to be the greatest of all civilizations and they wanted to conquer the world. And you find these important figures like Julius Caesar and Emperor Claudius. They invade Britain and they establish their empire in Britain. Now, when Romans came to Britain, they had a peaceful coexistence with the Celts and the Gaels. The Celts and the Gaels were not made to run away or move away from their own land. So, Roman invasion was very peaceful in one sense. And they brought the town civilization. Now, earlier, the Celts and the Gaels were thought to be very savage, barbarians without any civilization. When Romans came, they brought civilization along with them. They established a government and they also had an army to maintain peace. And most importantly, they brought Christianity along with them. Christianity was unknown to the British island till then. So the Romans, when they conquered Britain, they brought Christianity, and along with Christianity came the language Latin. So all the official things in Britain started to be in control of the Romans, who controlled everything in their official language, which is Latin. So Latin became a very important language in Britain then. And with this, slowly we find that Latin words were taken into their language by the Celts and the Gaels. And thus we have the influence of Latin on English, and that is due to the Roman invasion. A literary work of this period, which could be of importance, is the commentaries written by Julius Caesar. So, Caesar, when he came to Britain, he wrote about the Britain that he saw when he was conquering it, an account of Britain. He wrote about the heavy rain, the dense forest, the canopy, which made it very difficult to conquer the place. So, you just get an idea of the Britain in those times by reading commentaries. And Romans ruled for 300, 400 years, but then the mother country, Rome, was facing a lot of problems, and in order to protect their mother country, the Romans of England they left the place. Now, when the Romans left, the Celts and the Gaels of Britain did not know what to do. They were heavily protected by the Romans. They had a government, they had an army, and now all of a sudden, Romans withdrew from the island, and now the island doesn't have anything to protect them. Soon we find several other tribes like the Picts and the Scots trying to invade Britain and take control of Britain. Now, the Celts and the Gaels, the actual inhabitants of Britain, they became so powerless that they wanted help from somewhere. And that is how they approached the Anglo Saxons, the Germanic tribes, to come and help them in order to fight against the Picts and the Scots. Thus, we have the Anglo Saxons coming in. Now, Anglo Saxons, they are Germanic tribes which include three groups of people, including the Angles, Saxons, and the Jutes. Now, among these three tribes, the Angles were the most powerful ones. And it is from their tribe's name that the name England and the name English were all originated. So these tribes, the Anglo Saxons, came in, and very unexpectedly, They were not simply helping the Celts and the Gaels. They were actually trying to take over Britain, so they removed the Celts and the Gaels from the island. The Celts and the Gaels had to move away, and the entire island was taken over by the Anglo Saxons. And they established seven kingdoms, which is also called Heptarchy. The seven kingdoms are Northumbria, East Anglia, Mercia, Wessex, Sussex, Essex, and Kent. All these seven kingdoms were constantly under war. They would fight for political power and they would fight for money throughout. In between them, there used to be always battles and wars. Now, Wessex was politically thought to be more powerful than all the other kingdoms because it was ruled over by King Alfred the Great. Now, King Alfred is thought to be a great ruler, that the time period when he ruled England is thought to be the Golden Age. He was a great king, that he was not only called the king of the Wessex but also the king of Anglo-Saxons. He also encouraged art, education, and literature. King Alfred slowly brought all these seven kingdoms together and he became one power which could stand against the other invaders who came to take control over Britain. So, likewise, just like how we had the Pits and Scots coming in, we had the Vikings or the Danes who came to take over Britain. So, King Alfred also led the Anglo Saxon army against the Vikings or the Danes. And a very important work which is attributed to Alfred the Great is the Anglo Saxon Chronicle. Now, this is a work which he ordered to be written, in which the history of the Anglo Saxons is well recorded. Now, after the period of King Alfred, we find the Danes and the Vikings continually attacking Britain again and again, and they were not ready for a peaceful coexistence. They were plunderers, they were heathens, and they were very uncivilized. They continued to attack the land. Now, while all these political issues were happening, there were four dialects which were used in Britain then. The four dialects were Northumbrian, Mercian, Kentish, and West Saxon. Now, among these, West Saxon was a dialect which was used in Wessex. Wessex is the place ruled by King Alfred. Since King Alfred was very powerful, Wessex was politically powerful, and the language of Wessex was also used as kind of like an official language. So, West Saxon became the most important dialect among all these four. It is this West Saxon that we consider to be the standard form of Old English, that is, the language from which Old English has originated. So, this is the language of the Wessex, and as I told you, Wessex was politically powerful and it was the language used by King Alfred. Now, when all the plundering and attacks of the Danes and the Vikings were going on, the Normans attacked Britain. The Norman conquest took place in 1066 AD, which is a very important date. So, William the Conqueror, who was the Norman king then, he defeated the last Anglo Saxon king in the Battle of Hastings. So, with this Norman conquest, we find the last Anglo Saxon being dead. And there we have an end to the Anglo Saxon period. And from here, you find the Norman period, which we also call the Middle English period. Thus, Norman conquest is very important in the light of the history of English literature. And we find the feudal system, and their official language was French. Now, later, when Romans came, we talked about how Latin was their official language and how many words were taken from Latin into the Old English. Now, along with that, in Middle English, we find French coming in and many words from French being taken into Middle English. The Doomsday Book is an account of all the estates and the land. Since we are talking about the feudal system here, which is very important, we have the Doomsday Book. It talks about all the entries of all the estates and the lands which were owned by the landowners. This book was called the Doomsday Book because whatever is entered in the book is not to be questioned. Nobody has the right to question it. It is just like the last judgment. There are no questions regarding any entries. Now, since the video is about the Anglo Saxon period, we will stick on to the Anglo Saxon period and not the Norman conquest. But I have talked about Norman conquest here because this is the time period when Old English ends and the Middle English begins. It is with Norman conquest that we find the entry of French into Britain, and along with which Middle English begins. So, if we are going through a quick revision, you find we have the Celts and the Gaels, who are the original inhabitants first, with the Celtic and Gaelic languages, and then we have the Romans coming in and they bring Latin together with them, and then we have the Anglo-Saxons, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, the Germanic tribes, and then we have Viking invasions, the Danes and the Vikings who invaded Britain in between, and finally the Old English period ends with the Norman conquest. Now, since we know the history of the period well, let's move on to the literature, the Anglo Saxon literature or the Old English literature. Now, traditionally, the Anglo Saxon culture had a rich tradition of oral storytelling. So, whatever literature they had, it was transferred from one generation to the other orally through stories. But still, it's not like they don't have any written works at all. There are some works that are written down, but they did not survive. Very few works have survived into the present day. And even in the works which we have now, the written works, even those works, we do not know who has written these works. In most of the works, the authors are anonymous. There are only very exceptionally few cases in which we have the written work and we also have the name of the author who has written them. Now, earlier during the Anglo Saxon period, the official works were all done in Latin. Since I told you before, since Romans came, they had all the official documents in Latin. Latin was their language, and since they were in power, everything important was done in Latin. And even when something related to the literature was penned down, it was written in Latin only. Because writers thought that writing something in Latin would increase the value of their work and also their own worth would be increased. Because Latin was thought to be the language of the elite and educated. But slowly, the people who could write in Latin decreased, the people who could read Latin also decreased. So, Latin works, new Latin works were not coming up, and even the existing works were not able to be read by the normal people. And that is how people started to write in Old English. We have works being written, we see that works are being written in Old English from then on. Please also note that poetry was popular than prose. Now, one of the reasons would be since the Anglo Saxon literature was transferred orally, it is easier to transfer poetry with the rhythm and with all the poetic essences. Poetry is easier to be conveyed orally than prose. So, that could be a reason why during the Anglo Saxon period, poetry was more popular than prose. Now, here are some common features of Old English literature. Firstly, we find rhythmical verses that uses alliteration, which makes it sound like a chant. Now, alliteration is the repetition of sounds. For example, Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. We have a repetition of the sound per here. So, alliteration is a common feature of Old English literature, and we also have kenning. Kenning is a figure of speech where we use two or more words which has the similar meaning as the actual word. We don't use the exact word as it is, but instead to bring a poetic effect, we are using two or more words. Here, for example, the phrase swam road is used instead of the word sea, and sky candle instead of sun, and battle instead of battle, we have storm of spears. So we have alliteration, kenning, and the common themes used in the literature of the time are love for freedom, nature, wars or battles, and religion. Now let's look at some important Anglo Saxon poetry. Now, the most important poem we have from the Anglo Saxon period is the Beowulf. Now, Beowulf comes under the heroic poems. It is an epic poem, an Old English epic. We do not know anything about the author. The author is anonymous, and it's the only manuscript we have from the spirit. Now, Beowulf has a Scandinavian story in which The protagonist or the main character is Beowulf. We also did not have a name for this work. So the name of the protagonist or the main character is taken to be the work, the name for the work. So the whole work is based on three adventures of Beowulf, and there are three battles. In the first battle, Beowulf kills Grendel. Grendel, which is a monster, has to be killed, and the king calls Beowulf for help, and he kills this monster. And then there is a second battle in which the monster's mother comes to take revenge, and then Beowulf kills the monster's mother. And the third battle is when Beowulf kills a dragon, but in this battle, Beowulf is also very badly wounded and he dies. So, this is a very important work when we are learning about Old English literature. Now, we have a work related to the Beowulf, which is written by J.R.R. Tolkien. It's titled On Translating Beowulf. Tolkien talks about the difficulties he faced while he was translating the work. And here I have mentioned two other heroic poems. The first one is The Fight at Finnsburg, which is a retelling of one of the battle scenes in Beowulf. And then there is Walder, a version of the events of the life of Walter of Aquitaine. The next type of poetry that we will come across the spirit is the religious poetry. And here we have two important names. These names are not of poems or any works, they are names of poets. We have two important poets here, Caedmon and Cinewulf. They are both religious poets, obviously. Now, Caedmon is the earliest non English poet. He was a religious poet and he is thought to be the Anglo Saxon Milton. He is known to be the Anglo Saxon Milton. Now, it is believed that Caedmon was not a learned man or a poet in the beginning. He was only a shepherd. He did not know how to write poems. But one day he had a dream, and in the dream, God appeared to him and asked him to be a poet. So when he woke up, he became a learned man. He started composing poems. He became a poet. This is a story associated with Caedmon. Now, the most important work, the most popular work written by Caedmon is Hymn, the nine-line poem by Caedmon. Now, other than Caedmon, we also have Cinewulf, who is also a religious poet, and his important work is Dream of the Road. Now, here again, the narrator has a dream, and in the dream, the narrator comes across the cross on which Jesus was crucified, and the cross is speaking to the narrator. Now, the conversation between the narrator and the cross could be divided into three parts. In the first part, the narrator talks about his vision of the cross, how he saw the vision. And in the second part, the cross is telling the narrator about the crucifixion story. He is giving his point of view. The cross is giving the story of crucifixion to the narrator. And thirdly, we find narrator reflecting on the story, narrator's reflection about the vision. So, Caedmon and Cinewulf are two important poets who wrote religious poetry. Now, we are going to another category of poems, the wisdom poetry. Earlier, we talked about the heroic poems and the religious poems, and now we have wisdom poetry. Now, before talking about the wisdom poetry, there is something called the Exeter Book. Now, this is an anthology or a collection of Anglo Saxon poetry. This collection contains a lot of poems, and I have mentioned a very few of the poems in that: The Wanderer, The Seafarer, Dior, The Wife's Lament, The Husband's Message, and so on. Now, among all these poems, few poems are thought to come under the category of wisdom poetry. And two such poems are The Wanderer and The Seafarer. In the first poem, The Wanderer, there is a man who remembers an attack that happened in his youth. So, in the attack, all his close friends and the relatives were all killed, and the memories of the slaughter, the memories of all these murders are still there in his mind. And he is giving us an advice about the futility of war, how we should always not get into a war, how we should talk and solve things out. So, that is the poem Wanderer, and there is the wisdom that it conveys to the readers. And then we have the seafarer. The seafarer is about a man who is exiled from his home. He's exiled into the sea, and he talks about his life on the sea. So there are few poems like these in the extra book, poems that give us ways of living, tells us how to live, and gives us thoughts of wisdom. Such poetry comes under wisdom poetry. Now let's move on to prose. Now compared to poetry, there are no much important works which are written in prose. As told earlier, poetry was more popular than prose. A very important prose work from this period that we have is the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, written by Venerable Bede. Now, this work is about the history of England, but it is written in Latin. As told before, it was thought to be very prestigious to write in Latin. Latin was the official language, but it was later on converted, translated into Old English by King Alfred. So, King Alfred is a very important figure regarding Old English literature because, yes, he did love literature and art, and he has translated a lot of works from Latin to Old English. Now, just two important works that are very much important and is associated with King Alfred are the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which I have mentioned before in the video, and the Ecclesiastical History of English People, which is actually written by Bede in Latin and translated by King Alfred to Old English. With that, we come to an end to the discussion of the Anglo Saxon literature or the Old English literature. We have talked about the history of Britain during this period. We had the Celts and the Gaels and the Roman invasion, and then the Anglo Saxons coming in, and then we have the Danish invasions in between, and finally, with the Norman conquest, the Old English period comes to an end. And we talked about literature where poetry was more popular than prose. So that's all for this video. Please let me know your suggestions in the comment section. Thank you so much for watching.